Start. Right, hello everybody, and welcome to yet another much delayed consciousness hour, INCON. One of the running jokes I've had together with Sarah, but particularly with my previous producer, Dia Nunez, was the Archon attacks that we had. And today was an absolute classic. My internet has been absolutely rock solid, and it continued to be rock solid till the moment I decided that we needed to go live on this show. And the moment that happened, my internet just completely collapsed. So I'm now using my phone, my phone's access to the internet rather than my internal internet. So let's just hope it will it will be rock steady and everything else as well. Today's guest is somebody that I've interviewed twice before on previous consciousness hours, and I always enjoy talking to Jim Elvidge. The reason being that Jim is probably, I can say, the closest writer to my own work out there. Jim sees the world in a very similar way to myself. And indeed, over the last few days, I've been rereading his wonderful, comparatively new book, or his latest book, Digital Consciousness, A Transformative Vision. And I found that the similarities between what Jim is saying and what I'm saying is quite extraordinary. And indeed, I was quite surprised to discover a comment at the back here by some obscure limey writer who turns around and says, digital consciousness is an essential primer into the great paradigm change that awaits us in the next few years. In short, if your head does not spin after reading this book, you've not understood it. And that was some guy called Peake, who apparently wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception. Whoa, that's me. Do you remember the Double Take Brothers from years ago, the Fast Show? We just did that. Right, just telling you a little bit about Jim. Jim Elvidge received a master's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell University with a specialization in digital signal processing. Professionally, his career has been mostly in the high-tech industry, where he has held a variety of engineering and senior management positions. He holds patents in signal processing and was responsible for a number of entrepreneurial ventures, including developing one of the first PC-based music samplers in 1988 and co-founding Radio AMP, the internet's first private label web radio company. Elvidge is currently an agile and leadership consultant, helping companies become more lean, innovative, and agile in all aspects of their business. Outside of the high-tech arena, however, Elvidge has an alternative career focusing on a form of digital philosophy by synthesizing ideas from the varied fields of artificial intelligence, cosmology, nanotechnology, quantum mechanics, and the paranormal. And this is where I first came across Jim's incredible first book, The Universe Solved, which is, I strongly advise, one of probably the best books on the subject I've ever read anyway, until I read Digital Consciousness. So Jim, welcome to a slightly delayed and Archon-ridden consciousness hour.
Oh, thanks very much, Anthony. And always great to talk to you. Like I said, next time I'm in the UK, we're going to have a pint together. I consider you a friend. Yeah, like you said, common interest, common mentality. We look at things the same way. And I love being on your show. It's always a great interview and a good time.
Well, it's so important as well, particularly because of your technical background. You know, many people write about the whole idea of the digital universe and everything else as well, but there are a few writers in the field who have your qualifications and in-depth knowledge of the subject of electrical engineering as much as anything else as well. So you approach this as a scientist and as a qualified engineer. So your work is quite unique in many ways, I think that is. Now, one of the things that I've always wanted to talk to you about is the similarities between your hypothesis and the hypothesis of Nick Bostrom. And if you would like, if you could you go into some detail for the listeners, watchers, and the people who are checking out this video and this discussion, exactly what Nick Bostrom's hypothesis was about the idea of us living in a simulation, because it is fascinating and it's intriguing. So if you can tell us a little bit about that, that would be really great.
Sure. And interestingly, he wrote a paper. I really believe the first release of that came out in, I don't know, 99 or 2001 or something. But now when you look at it, it's 2003. So it could have been an updated version. But it was called The Simulation Argument. And I remember when I read it, I was at my startup. So that's why I know it was during that time, the first release of it. And, you know, it came out the same time as the movie The Matrix, and it was almost like this confluence of ideas, you know, from pop culture and from Oxford University, you know, places of learning, different philosophers and scientists thinking about the same thing all at the same time, which is, an interesting phenomenon by itself. There's some coincidence there, some synchronicities. And basically, what he says is he's kind of musing about where we're going to go in the future. And one possibility, I mean, a lot of this is based on the fact that technology is doubling every year and a half. Moore's law has been a relentless doubling of transistor density, computer speed, things like that, for the past 40, 50 years. And if you carry that out a little bit longer, you're going to get to a point where we can create simulations of reality that are indistinguishable from the one that we're in. And you can almost do that now. I mean, some of the VR systems are really, really good. Certainly from an audio standpoint, you can't tell. And the visuals are getting better and better. So his view was, we're going to get to that point at some time when we create these simulations, and we'll probably have some kind of technology where it's much less invasive than today, where you put goggles on and things like that. Maybe there's another way through nanobots or something. Diverging a little bit, but the point is that we'll probably get to the point where we can create these simulations. So how do we know that we're not already in a simulation? And that's his question. And to answer the question, he posits three possibilities. One is we're not in a simulation, and we just happen to be in the real world before the time when we start creating these simulations. Two, we are not in a simulation because we never really pursue that avenue of inquiry any further. We don't create simulations. We don't go down that path. And I think we can all kind of throw that one out because we're already halfway down that path. Just like every other technology that has its dangers and its positive points, we pursue it regardless. And then three, we do achieve that, what he calls a post-human stage, and create simulations, and we'll create millions and millions and millions of them. So the odds, if that's the case, the odds are we're already in one. So the odds are much higher that we're in a simulation now than we're not in a simulation. And that's the basis of his argument. Now, that sat around for years, and a lot of people, they still pull that argument out, and it's still a very interesting and good argument about the possibility of being in a simulation. And we would have to kind of define the word simulation and what that actually means. But what it's also generated is a lot of discussion around sort of evil intent driven simulations. The Matrix was an AI, driving things. Maybe it's us in the future in his point of view. And in other ways, it could be, I don't know, I think Andre Lind called it a physicist hacker from another galaxy, could have created a simulation that we're all in. So there are all these possibilities where there's an inventor or creator with a simulation, and we're just, stuck in it. I don't think that that's necessarily the way things are, and I have some reasons for that, which we'll probably end up talking about. But that's the basis of his argument, and it is a good one. It's a good logical argument.
So, I mean, I've always found Bostrom's ideas really intriguing, and the idea of the application of Moore's law. And I know that I've heard that Moore's law has slowed down somewhat. But nevertheless, there is more and more evidence, and we know from the popularity of a lot of writers at the moment that the evidence that this may be a simulation is becoming more and more mainstream. And all the time I keep seeing announcements made. And every time I see the announcement made, I think, God, people like Jim and I have been writing about this for years, but at least everybody's starting to catch up to a certain extent. But one of the areas that we didn't touch upon when I last interviewed you, which is an area I'm moving towards as well, is within this overall scenario, the philosophical concept of idealism. The idea that there are two separate parts of reality. There is consciousness and there is the physical universe. And the two of them, usually people don't tend to zoom in on this, but I know that in your latest work, you're very much interested in this interface between idealism and digital reality. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. And you're right. Those are kind of the two basic premises of the book. One is that deep down, our reality is digital, and the other is that, our consciousness is really separate from our bodies. And that could mean a lot of things. It could mean we're in a virtual reality. Your consciousness, is separate from your avatar in a virtual reality. Same thing could be happening right now. So it all kind of aligns. The important thing, I think, let's kind of set the stage for this discussion is it's very difficult to talk about this without talking about two different levels of reality, because what Bostrom and Elon Musk talk about and those kind of things, they talk about one level of reality, not the other. And what I mean is one level of reality being the apparent physical world, the apparent physical reality that you and I are living in right now. The stuff that we deal with when we look out, at the stars, that's part of the physical reality. When we look in a microscope, when they're quantum mechanics experiments, all of that is part of our apparent physical reality, which in my mind is probably more virtual than physical. The other reality is what's underneath that. You could call that a deeper level reality or a higher level reality, whatever term you choose. But that one isn't what we're talking about today. Well, we can talk about that in the sense of the afterlife and near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and things like that, because that's where you start interacting in that reality. But when people like Bostrom and Elon Musk and others who talk about living in a simulation, they're talking about the apparent physical reality that we're in. And that's the one that I'm talking about being digital. And that's the one in which our consciousness is separate. In the other one, the deeper level reality, it's all consciousness, probably. So anyway, let's talk about the first one, the apparent physical reality. Investigating the nature of that is a lot of what this book is about. And last time we talked, I remember we talked a lot about the evidence for it being digital, and there's tons and tons of evidence for that, and very little evidence to the contrary. In fact, none, essentially. But the other aspect to this is the idea of idealism. So historically, there have been a couple philosophies. There was the materialism philosophy, which is, everything is mechanistic and deterministic, and, your consciousness comes from your brain. And then there's the idealism philosophy, which is, no consciousness, something separate, our ability to kind of introspect and think and be aware of our existence doesn't seem to make sense to come from, physical atoms and particles and things like that. How is that even possible? And those materialists will pass it off and say, well, when there's enough complexity, this arises, but it really doesn't make any sense. It's just a way to kind of justify their belief system, essentially. So I spend a lot of time in the book looking at evidence, real evidence, that our world is more an idealism type world than a materialism world. And one of them comes directly from the field of science, which is quantum mechanics. The quantum experiments that have been done, I mean, you probably see them every year or two. There's another headline out of Nature magazine or Scientific American or whatever that says, scientists prove that objective reality doesn't exist. It's been going on for 10 years. 2007, I think, was the first time I saw it with some of the research coming out of Vienna. And then, in China and in Edinburgh and places all over the world, there's more and more research that proves that there is no fundamental objective reality, which kills materialism. And then that tells you there has to be something else. And one of the key points is the observer effect. So if our ability to observe the result of an experiment can actually cause that result to happen or can influence that result, then that tells you that there's something about the nature of our consciousness interacting with reality that can't be explained by a materialistic philosophy. So that's really the science behind it. Other areas are things like the placebo effect, or I don't know if you're probably familiar with Donald Hoffman's evolutionary argument. In that argument, we would not likely evolve to be aware of our real reality. And then he creates a model that looks very much like the way our real reality is. near-death experiences. How can you explain those? You know, people have tried to explain them by saying it's oxygen deprivation from the brain, but there are people who have shared death experiences who are sitting right next to somebody that's dying, and they have the same kind of experience as them. They have no oxygen deprivation from the brain. And fighter pilots that go into a 6G spin or something, you know, they have oxygen deprivation and they don't have near-death experiences. You know, people have near-death experiences, you know, in different cases, or spiritual experiences, which have nothing to do with being close to death. And it's the same kind of experience. So nothing about materialism explains any of that, especially that, you know, the large body of evidence of these kinds of things indicate that when people have had those experiences, they have a whole different worldview at the end of it, a whole different point of view. You would think that if they were hardcore materialists, this wouldn't bother them. You know, they'd stick with that philosophy, but they don't. The people just change. So there's that. There's past life experiences. There's psychic phenomena, telepathy. There have been so many tens of thousands of telepathic experiments, and taken one at a time, each one you could argue, well, the results could have been due to chance. You know, it's kind of like if I flipped a penny in front of you 10 times, once in a while it's going to come up 10 times heads in a row, right? But that's why a lot of this research is about understanding statistics. And with those psychic experiments, especially telepathy and some of the precognition experiments, the collective body of evidence is such that it could only be due to chance one in like a quadrillion times, you know, and I've got the data in the book to support this. So even though it might be a subtle experience or a subtle energy or a very subtle effect, when you look at it statistically and aggregate it across a lot of experiments, it's tremendously impactful in terms of the point that it makes. So those things appear to actually exist. A little bit of precognition, a little bit of telepathy, things like that. You cannot explain that with materialism. So group consciousness, Mandela effect, the universal human experience. I mean, there are just a million different things that we can talk about that indicate that the consciousness is separate from the brain. And that's a key aspect of this philosophy.
Well, that's the central point, isn't it? I mean, you referenced the work in Vienna and previous to that in Innsbruck with Anton Zeilinger and his little merry bunch of men over there. And it's always intrigued me that these phenomenal experiments are taking place and have been taking place now for 2 decades, probably more, ever since Alain Aspect and Roger Dalibard did their famous Paris experiment in 1981-82. We know that there's something very, very strange and very mysterious about the deeper nature of reality. And we have things like, we have superposition, we have the quantum Zeno effect, we have many cases here. And these things fly in the face of the modern understanding of science, because it seems to me that the general public and many scientists are stuck in the science of 120 years ago. They're refusing to move forward even when the evidence is screaming out at them. And I sometimes wonder whether the problem is that maybe the terminology we use, maybe it's because writers like you and I are trying to do the science, but there's an awful lot of writers out there that just have this idea, throw the word quantum in, and you've got a solution. You know, throw the word quantum in, you know, you have quantum healing and quantum nonsense that you have. But people like you and I are trying to do the serious science. And when I drill into the science, all I am is astounded and amazed. And of course, one of the major problems that they will argue, and it's something we probably need to discuss, is the first one is the use of the word simulation probably is questionable. And we need to come up with a better terminology than that, because that suggests that something's a copy of something else in some way. But we also need to be thinking along the lines of, when we talk about the collapse of the wave function, when we talk about the observer effect, the question is, as if you're taking an idealistic viewpoint on this, the question is, how can what would be argued to be an insubstantial consciousness have an effect on physical objects? And how do you think we get round that? Maybe you could describe, for instance, some of the issues you discuss in your book and I discuss in my book, like the quantum Zeno effect, and also the twin slit experiment and various other things like that, of just explaining the interface between consciousness, how there is strong evidence that what I anticipate is going to happen actually happens. And not only that, but me thinking about something or having something happen can also influence what's happened millions of years ago. You know, the John Wheeler delayed choice experiments and everything else. So if you can explain a little bit about these things, because I never get the opportunity on this show to discuss these aspects. You see the pun? It was really good. It was subtle, that one. But if you can, Jim, that would be really good.
Sure, yeah. And this is, you know, I don't want to kind of toot my own horn here, but as far as I know, you know, if you like look on Wikipedia or one of these sites and you look up quantum mechanics or the different models of quantum mechanics, there are all different kinds out there. There's the many worlds version, there's the Copenhagen version, there's pilot waves, there's, I don't know, 14, 15 different explanations of quantum mechanics. Scientists all over the place are trying to say, well, you know, I've got it. I've got the answer that explains quantum Zeno and observer effect and the double slit anomalies and things like that. And as far as I know, I'm the only one that really has a solid explanation for it. And so if I may say, you know, that's one thing that could be interesting about my work, is that I really kind of go into that and say, okay, here is the actual explanation for the observer effect, and here is the actual explanation for the Zeno effect and things like that. So yeah, let's talk about that. As an analogy, you know, we'll think about the observer effect. I like to use video game analogies because everybody's familiar with them, can understand how they're computationally generated and things like that. So in a video game, imagine that you are in a place where there's a room. You're playing like a fantasy type game. You're walking through the woods or whatever, and you come across a little hut. And the hut has no doors and no windows, or it has a door, no windows. You can't look inside. The door has a key hole in the lock, but there's no key anywhere. So the question is, does the system that is rendering that object, that hut, does it need to design the inside of the hut if nobody's ever been in there? And the answer is no. It would be a waste of CPU cycles to do so. However, if the game designers decide to hide a key under a rock near the door in release, 5.7 of that game, and somebody finds it, the first time they stick the key in the keyhole and open the door, now that is the ideal time to generate the inside of that room. So I call that dynamic reality generation. And that is exactly the way the observer effect and the double slit experiment seem to work. It's when we have the need to understand where a particle goes, which slit it goes through, when we have the need for that, the need reveals itself and it locks into reality exactly in the same way. Why would that be? Well, the only explanation that I can think of that's reasonable is because the greater universe is efficient, that our virtual reality that we call, the apparent physical reality that we live in here, is being generated somehow through our need to observe it, to interact with it. If we don't need to interact with something, nobody needs to look at that. We don't need to look at where the position of every particle in this cup of coffee is until we get a microscope and an electron microscope and really start digging in there. Then everything has to lock into place. And this is what causes entanglement. When something locks into place, we've used the term collapsing of the wave function, the probability wave function. No, everything's in a probability until it is observed. Or, let's talk about the word observed, until there is a need for it to come into reality. Then once it comes into reality, it seems to be locked in a way where neighboring particles that have interacted with each other in some way, are entangled forever. You can take these two particles, separate them by light years, and they've done experiments. Obviously, they can't go light years apart, but they've done experiments where, in outer space, they've taken particles and demonstrated that indeed they are entangled at that level. So what would explain that is something called a finite state machine. You know, again, if I were creating a simulation, when I need to create a new electron, I will instantiate that electron with a little model, a little computer model of how an electron works. And again, when I say computer, don't think of the laptop on your desk, think of whatever computational mechanism the deeper reality can use to conjure up particles in our virtual reality. So that thing can be generated by what's called a finite state machine, which is just essentially an algorithm that says, you know, based on certain inputs, you know, this will be the next output. This is how this particle would behave based on certain inputs. Well, if you do that at the same time with two particles, you're using an instantiation of the same finite state machine. You could use the same, I don't know, random number seed or whatever that mechanism is that sets it off. And now they are in lockstep. And this is why John Wheeler and Feynman had these great conversations about electrons. There being only one electron in the universe. You know, I think it was you know, Wheeler that said, I just realized why electrons behave so strangely. There's only one. And
yeah, and why they all look alike, you know, why they're all identical.
Exactly alike. And the reason is they're created from a template, you know, and so that again is evidence for us being in a virtual reality where there's some computational mechanism that is creating these things as needed. And then entanglement is perfectly explained in that way.
Jim, just to give an aside explanation here, just so that the guys out there really understand what we're talking about here, can you just explain a little bit about the two things you've mentioned? You've already talked about entanglement, but exactly what is so odd about the observer effect, A, in the twin slit experiment, and B, in the quantum Zeno effect, just so that everybody, a lot of people probably know of the twin slit experiment, or the double slit experiment, but less people know about Itano and the quantum Zeno effect. So if you can explain those two a little bit, just so the guys out there really realize this is hard science. This is not woo-woo, new age nonsense. This is the real deal.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in the double slit experiment, they've done sequentially complex experiments, successfully complex experiments over the years that have closed the gaps of loopholes in these experiments. So originally, when they first did it, they would say, okay, you know, these particles are going through these double slits. As soon as we put a detector at one of those slits, you know, it seems like the particles lock into place and we know where they went through. And this is based on a screen at the other end where you observe an interference pattern. Interference patterns would occur if particles are waves. It doesn't occur if they're actual particles. So when you see two vertical lines on the interference pattern, that tells you that they have somehow determined which slit to go through. When you see waves on the screen, then it's a probability function. So as soon as they put a detector there that will detect where the particles go through, which slit they go through, the interference pattern disappears and it becomes just those two vertical patterns. So the original argument was, well, they're interfering with each other somehow. So they started sending them through one particle at a time, and bingo, still the same result. So that wasn't it. Then there was the argument of, okay, the detector is taking some energy away from things. So then they put the detector on the other side of the screen, and we're able to determine through lasers and things like this which slit it went through, and same result. And one by one, they close all those loopholes, all those arguments that the materialists had that could possibly explain these things. You know, John Bell did some research on this, Leggett, others, you know, to identify hidden variables and you know, other mechanisms that were possible for explanations for this. And one by one, they've all been closed. I think they've been closed now for 10, 12 years. And there are still people that are just hanging on to the materialist idea. There has to be something there, you know, and as brilliant a guy as Einstein, you know, he fought it till the end of his life, which is really kind of telling about human nature. You know, you ask the question, why do materialists still hang on to this? Why do they not look at the greater body of evidence? And it's a really good question. I mean, Einstein didn't either. He looked at it, but he kept on hanging on to that idea that there had to be an underlying mechanism. There had to be hidden variables. Now, in a way,
of course, there was the wonderful irony, wasn't there? There was the 1937 thought experiment, the Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen thought experiment was the whole thing that kicked the whole thing off, trying to prove one thing, and he ended up other people proving something completely different. And that's the irony of science, isn't it, in many ways?
Yeah.
But pray continue.
And I think in a way, Einstein was right. There are hidden variables. Like the hidden variables, though, are beneath the level of our apparent physical reality. We talked about those two levels before. The hidden variables are beneath that. It's what's creating that underneath. And nobody really understands that yet. We catch a glimpse of it during near-death experiences and past life regressions and things like that, or spiritual experiences. We catch a glimpse of that reality, but we really don't understand that one. And
yeah, because it's very much, again, isn't it? It's David Bohm and the implicate and explicate orders idea.
Absolutely.
The idea that there are different levels of even size, and it's at that level. So yeah, there are hidden variables, but as you quite rightly say there, the answers that they're getting are not the answers they want to hear. They want to hold on to this materialist idea that everything is somehow solid and it's real, and consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain behavior. It's nothing more than a happenstance of electricity with chemicals reacting in the brain. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know it self-evidently isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you also mentioned the quantum Zeno effect, and that's a fascinating one. That is essentially saying that if you constantly observe something, it's not going to change its state. So we have like a exponential decay of particles. If you actually constantly observe at the microscopic level those particles, will you actually see one of them decay? Now, the interesting thing about the quantum Zeno effect is that when you do watch something that closely, it appears to reset the, what I called the finite state machine before. So if there's a non-exponential process, the interesting thing about exponential processes are they look the same at any time scale. So whether that resets or not, you'll never know. But if there is a process that say it just suddenly changes, over time, then when you do constantly observe things, you don't get that sudden change. And that, again, is explained easily by this same argument related to the observer effect, because the state of the system is reset, every time you observe it, except for the non-memoryless systems where, for example, exponential decay, it doesn't really make any difference. So all of these weird quantum anomalies have a great explanation in digital consciousness theory or simulation theory or whatever. And you asked before about the word simulation. You're absolutely right. It's a heated word. It's kind of like in my day job, there are certain change management ideas that people get tired of hearing after a while. They don't want to hear that word. And so you have to change the word, to get past the fatigue, and people put the barriers up when they start hearing that word. It's the same with the word simulation. It feels like a flight simulator or some computer simulation or something. And that's not the right analogy, but we don't really have a good lexicon for explaining these things.
Well, maybe this is the thing we need to come up with, Jim, is between the two of us to kind of come up with something, because I'm in the process of writing my next book at the moment, and I have sections on simulation theory and everything else as well. And I keep falling into the same trap of using the word simulation, and I keep pulling myself back and saying, no, you've got to come up with something better than that, because people will criticize that. I also like the analogy that, the idea of the quantum Zeno effect, when people turn around and say it's a classic example of the old adage that a watched kettle never boils. And, the same kind of thing happens there. Now, all the time you're talking about this, and you touched upon psychic phenomena, you touched upon esoteric belief systems and everything else as well. So in terms of general paranormal experiences, and by the way, I really like your model here, and it has elements of Tom Campbell in it, but I think you're taking it further than Tom does. But in terms of, say, paranormal experiences, ghosts, UFO sightings, these kind of things, or what Sarah in terms of lucid dreaming, out of body experiences and everything, what's your thoughts on this? How does this fit in with your overall model?
Yeah, it fits in perfectly. So if you're in a physical materialist reality, those things don't make any sense. Telepathy doesn't make any sense because we don't know of a mechanism where people can, there are energies coming out of your brain that are interacting with energies in somebody else's brain. But if you're living in a virtual reality, those quote out of band experiences like telepathy make total sense. Let's go back to the video game analogy. You've seen probably images, videos of kids that got their headsets on and they're playing, I don't know what they play these days. It used to be World of Warcraft in my day and other things like that. But they're talking to the people who are controlling other avatars on the screen, but they're talking out of band, meaning they're using a communication channel that's going through the internet and a whole different channel and communicating with these people. So that's not, that would perfectly explain telepathy. That's what it is. It's out of band communication. Well, what's the out of band channel is that Bohmian underlying construct, which, in my view is a great model, the holographic universe. But what's underneath that is that other deeper reality that I was talking about. So why don't we have that all the time? Why can't we communicate with each other all the time? It is an interesting question. And I think the reason is because we need to feel individuated in order to trust the virtual reality experience that we're having. Why? Because that's how we learn things. If I were to be playing one of these video games and some monster comes on the screen and I'm about to die, boom, I just hit the reset switch, right? But if I'm really in that situation, I'm going to have to face it. I'm going to have to figure out, I'm going to have to survive. I'm going to have to develop some skills. I'm going to have to evolve my thinking or my consciousness or something in some way. So it's important for us to, as negative of a connotation as individualism can be at times, that generates all the ideas of competition and scarcity, false scarcity of resources and wars and all those kinds of things. It's still important, I think, for us to feel like we are individuated in some way, because that's how we learn and that's how we evolve our consciousness, and that's how we take this reality seriously. Deep down, we are all deeply connected. And I think in the deeper reality, in between lives, if you will, we can communicate it freely with other, conscious entities that are separated in that way. So, so that explains something like telepathy. Precognition is another really interesting one. There have been great studies on precognition, which again, statistically are significant. It's not an effect that you can necessarily repeat, but it's a subtle effect that appears to show that there's something there. And you probably know of or have heard of people who have had this, spidey sense of an oncoming truck or something like that when you're driving or whatever. And usually that's explained as your subliminal senses, heard the horn or out of the corner of your eye, you detected it. But there are others. There are ones where I remember the late Art Bell talking about a time when he was compelled to walk over to his window and look out the window because he thought somebody was going to crash into his car that was parked out in front of the house. And he walked out the window, he's looking at the car, there was no other car in sight, and then all of a sudden along comes the car and crashes into it. So, these kinds of things that just happen rarely. I mean, it happened once in my life too, and it was unexplained statistically. So these kind of things.
Could you explain that? Are you willing to share that with us?
Oh yeah, sure. I was in high school, and it was a total, inconsequential experience, but I just, I was sitting in a room and I was like, my friend Bill is going to call me on the phone. So I'll just get up and I'll walk across the room to the phone. We didn't have cell phones in those days. So you actually had to walk somewhere to, pick up the phone that was hanging on the wall. And, I know enough about telephony. I know that the way it works is that the ringtone is, don't know enough, I guess, because I don't remember this, but I think it was 2 seconds on, 4 seconds off. 2 seconds on, 4 seconds off back in the day, at least in the United States. So that means that if there had been just some little tinkle of the bell, that I subliminally heard, then, as long as that was as long as less than 6 seconds elapsed between when it occurred to me to go try to pick up the phone and when I got there, then it could be explained by that. But it took longer than that. It was clear across the room. I walked across the room. I said, Bill's going to call me. And I picked up the phone and it hadn't even rung. And I said, hey, and he was on the other end. And it was just one of those really strange things. And he was baffled. He goes, I didn't even hear the ringtone coming back saying that the call had gotten connected. What are you doing? And I was like, I don't know. Somehow I knew you were calling.
I remember many years ago, I had a very similar experience of this, which I don't think I've actually mentioned on any of my interviews before, but it just reminds me, and I'd just like to share this with you now. And it involved an American friend of mine, Bob Steen, who you remind me of a lot, by the way. You actually have the same way of saying things and everything else, quite strange, which reminded me of this. And many, many years ago, around 1978, 79, something like that, I was working in a company in the deep south of London, a place called Surbiton. And one of my friends there, she was developing psychical skills. Now, Kitty was a very wild child. She wasn't the kind of person that you'd necessarily believe would be into this type of thing, but she was. And I'd mentioned this to my friend Bob, who was living in Belgium at the time. And Kitty had said to me on various occasions, she felt she had some kind of bond with Bob in some way or other. And now Bob lived in Belgium, American guy living in Belgium, very rarely came over to the UK. And Kitty phones me one Friday afternoon out the blue, and she phones me in the office and she says, when is Bob coming over? And I said, I don't know. I haven't heard from him for months. I've no idea when he's coming. And she said, oh, okay. And I put the phone down. The minute I put the phone down, it rang again. And I picked the phone up and it was Bob. And I said, Bob, this is extraordinary. I've just been on the phone to Kitty, and Kitty's turning around asking when you're actually coming over back to London. And he said, you're not going to believe this. I'm bringing the car over for service. Bob was from quite a wealthy background. He was bringing the Rolls over to have it serviced. And he said, I'm bringing the roller over at the moment for service. I'm on the South Circular Road in London. And I went, I don't believe this. And he said, okay, well, I'll get down to your sports and social club tonight at 5. I'll see you there. And you can introduce me to Kitty. I put the phone down. The minute I put the phone down, it rings again. And I pick it up and it's Kitty. And she said, so we're meeting at the sports and social club then? And I said, Kitty, how the hell did you do that? And she said, it's just the way of the world. I just knew. I just instinctively knew. And I found that absolutely an extraordinary case. Now, Bob had no way of communicating with Kitty. They'd never met. They didn't know each other's phone numbers or anything. And I found that absolutely extraordinary. And it just is evidence of this. And of course, Sarah, now, would you like to come in with any comments you're thinking in the background? Because we know we hear you thinking away there and making extensive notes. What's your thoughts so far?
Well, I wanted to ask what the difference is actually to both of you really between an idea of digital consciousness and a digital simulation universe and an electrical and a magnetic universe. And, I think about an electrical and a magnetic universe and electromagnetism. And I think we are creatures that, at least in our past, have been sensitive to magnetic forces. So I wonder what you think about that, how that could work in with this idea of a digital consciousness.
Jim.
Yeah, sure. I certainly wouldn't be an expert in that area, I don't think, but I would say that, like, what I understand about electricity and magnetism, I took many classes in that. It's magnetism comes from a moving electric field, and electrical fields come from, moving magnetic fields, and they continue to, emanate in that way. So the electrical system has a lot to do with particles with a charge, moving through a distance. Is a particle, is at a very high level then of this reality, because what I think of as a particle could be a very kind of macroscopic object compared to the really deep digital nature of reality. So when we talk about digital consciousness or the digital nature of reality, it's a much more fundamental level than, electricity and magnetism. That said, the effects of those things, could be something that, impacts the way people interact, or, impacts the way the universe expands and so forth. And that is, again, it's all within the apparent physical reality that we have. What I try to get to is like the deeper level and say, this is something that's not a field, like electromagnetic fields tend to be thought of as a continuous thing. The definition of a field is something that has a number associated with some place in space, and that number can vary. So an electric field or a magnetic field is going to have a vector of direction, and an intensity at every single point in space around an object. But what creates that underneath is really more of a digital thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so.
Well, I guess I think myself, I guess, as a pantheist, and I think that everything in the universe is divine. So do you think the creator of this matrix or simulation is God or a divine being?
That was going to be my question as well, Jim, in terms of, we'll come back to UFOs, but the whole concept of panpsychism, and how does that fit in with all this?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I've actually had a little more recent thought about that as well, because there's a school of thought that is trying to explain a lot of things by saying, panpsychism, everything is imbued with some level of consciousness. Where I differ from that is I think that the consciousness is the deeper level of reality. So panpsychism says that the objects, this coffee mug here has some limited level of consciousness, and everything does. And so that kind of explains the hard problem of consciousness. I think the problem with that, though, is that I think it does a disservice to the soul, the nature of the soul, or the nature of our individuated consciousness that seems to live on and seems to reincarnate. I tend to believe in reincarnation for a lot of reasons. And panpsychism doesn't have much to say about that. So I think panpsychism is a model that's sort of halfway between materialism and sort of digital consciousness, or idealism. But it's only dealing with the idea of consciousness as some, mysterious entity in our macroscopic world, as opposed to underneath the deeper level of reality, which in my mind is, as you asked the question, you can use the word God or all that there is. I tend to use all that there is. God conjures up often an individual. And I think the nature of our system is such that the nature of all that there is such that that's what God is. It's all that there is. It isn't an individual that says, oh, I'm going to go create this, or I'm going to control this, or whatever. It's all of us connected together. All consciousness is connected together is God. And that aligns perfectly with Eastern philosophies. It aligns perfectly with the shamanistic teachings, with spiritual experiences that people have in the modern world, as well as what they've written down, spiritual adepts in the ancient world. We're all part of one, and God is in all of us, and that kind of thing. It all makes sense if you think of the underlying nature of reality being a sea of consciousness, and we are what our souls are is like an individuated aspect of that is in control of our avatar in this virtual reality.
I very much is Sarah, I was just going to say that's very much interesting because this book, I contributed a chapter to this in 2016, Pandeism and Anthology, edited by a friend of mine, Nugent Mapson. And my chapter in there was Pandeism, the holographic universe and the simulation theory. So clearly, again, it shows just how much synchronicity we're talking about here. Now, pandeism as a concept is really probably what you're talking about here, the idea that God is everything, but everything is in fact consciousness. And we are just sort of emanations from an ocean of consciousness that we feel are individuated, in which case this can explain things such as the collective unconscious. It can explain why it is that we seemingly may reincarnate from other people. It's because it's a huge memory field that we can engage in many ways. So this is the really quite interesting leading edge thinking going on here. Sorry, sir, I butted in there. You were about to make a comment.
No, I think. Sorry. Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
I was just gonna, you reminded me of what my other question was gonna be when you were talking about this idea being echoed in Eastern philosophy and things like this, is the kind of cultural tracking of it. Like, are we using the term digital consciousness and a simulation theory because our modern culture is giving us these words and these ideas that we can then overlay upon this idea? Because like you say, like very early religious ideas and early philosophies are all about this idea that we are all emanating from the all or the source and we're all one. Absolutely. Are we going to end up just like completing this circle and coming back to that idea, but using different words to express it? Just
very quickly, Sarah, as a question to you, because you know your area of expertise in terms of Egyptian theology and everything else, is this one of the concepts that you found in Egyptian theology?
Well, Egyptians have the idea of a soul perpetuating after death, and they have different aspects of the body. And then there are lots of different creation myths in Egyptian religion, so they're all kind of a little bit different. But there is this idea of everything coming from nothing, and the first kind of emanation from the abyss or chaos, and gods being sculpted and then creating humans, which is reflected in all religions, really. Most creation myths involve something coming from nothing, and then those gods making humans out of their own image or taking part of themselves and creating humans out of it. So I believe, I was thinking about this the other day, I was listening to music, and I think you can listen to music and life and reality is a bit like this. You can be fully engaged in reality and you can experience it as divine, and you can have this incredible divine experience of just being out in nature, for example. Or you could just have it on in the background in the way that you can have music on in the background and be like not paying much attention to it. And then sometimes you really listen to music and it suddenly feels really divine and beautiful. And I think that inventions such as language, technology, tools, they take us away from what is divine in reality, that we should be giving 100% of our attention to in order to experience it as the divine thing that it is. But I think language especially separated humans away from that divine experience of reality just being what it is. Like, we're always looking for these secrets, but actually everything is just in plain sight. Everything is divine, I think.
So, yeah, I think you nailed it. Yeah, I think you nailed it, Sarah. I think language is one of those things that, you know, has really created the need for us to categorize and compartmentalize and separate out more, and maybe disconnect, like you said. I totally agree. And we get hung up on terms, and people on these forums, physics forums and things like that, they get all angry about, well, it's not a simulation because this and that, or it's, you know, what are you talking about, God? And, you know, it's just words that we're using. They're metaphors. You know, a lot of the ideas that you talked about, the ancient myths and so forth, were metaphors. And they're metaphors that make sense when you think about the world in these two levels of reality, in the way that we're talking about. They kind of make sense.
Right, so we'll move back to the UFO issue as well in a few minutes. But one of the things that has long intrigued me is the concept of Wigner's friend. And the Wigner's friend argument is it's an application of Schrodinger's cat, whereby the duality of the one scientist sees a live cat, one sees a dead cat, and if one of the scientists then has a friend, the kind of weirdness then goes to the scientist, and then if the scientist then sees a friend and imparts information to that friend almost becomes infected in terms of this kind of weirdness about the world. But apparently there's been a recent experiment which seems to have proven Wigner's friend to be actually true rather than just a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that really intrigues me.
Yeah, I love that one too. It was just another in the sequence of there is no objective reality type results from scientific experiments. But yeah, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert on Wigner's paradox like some people might be, but it's the idea that Schrodinger's cat, you've got a cat and a vial of poison and some radioactive element that decays, that triggers the vial of poison and may cause the cat to die in an enclosed box, so you don't know what's in the box. And because of the nature of the observer effect, the cat is neither alive nor dead until somebody observes the result of that experiment. But if you actually were to put a human in the box with a gas mask maybe or something like that, from their point of view, the cat would have a definitive disposition, alive or dead, whereas the person outside of the box wouldn't. So there are two separate realities of people who are living in the one reality. That was, best I understand it, that was Wigner's paradox. And they have been able to recreate this again with, lasers and mirrors and double slits and things like this, recreate this kind of experiment. It was done in Edinburgh, and they tested it, it was a couple of years ago, and they confirmed that it is true that there are these two separate realities from two different observational perspectives to a certainty of 5 standard deviations, which I think is like odds of 1 in 3 million or so against chance. So again, it's one more thing that says our reality is soft. This all makes perfect sense to me. Again, if we go back to our model of a video game, I could be a player in a video game and experience something completely different than somebody else. Imagine we're in a movie, we're all sitting there watching the same thing on the screen. How do we know we all saw the same thing? Well, we talked to each other about it afterwards, right? But if we had headsets on and we were watching, a simulation, and everybody in the theater was watching that, we might start to suspect, everybody could be watching something slightly different. How would you know? You'd have to ask them, well, did you see that guy jump out there? What color was that car? Those kinds of things. And, it's probably not enough to just talk to somebody to understand how they see things. The differences are probably much tinier than that. So in the Wigner's experiment, the differences are very small. It's a microscopic thing. It's nothing that we would notice at the macroscopic level. But it makes total sense that there would be multiple perspectives, because we are individuated consciousness living in a subjective reality, which is virtual. And therefore we have our own world that we're dealing with, our own subjective experience. And it could be different than anybody else's. And there's no way to really know unless you can really compare notes incredibly well. And then there's all the faulty memory issues, and you see things a little differently than I do, your eyesight is different, whatever. There's really no way to know that things are different. So to have the scientists use lasers and very precise measurement equipment and demonstrate that this exists, to me, is just more validation of our theory.
Well, there's the idea, isn't it? Like, it's the Unruh effect, which I'll be discussing in great detail in my new book. And in the Unruh effect, it effectively proves that depending upon whether you're an accelerated speed, accelerating within the vacuum, that subatomic particles will appear for you, that will not appear in the existence and the visual field or the perceptual field of somebody who is not moving relative to the background. Now, this is uncanny. This means subatomic particles are totally dependent upon the viewpoint of the person that's doing the perceiving. And again, this is science. This is not something that is, is being clutched by some kind of new age wacko. This is something that is actual fact, or is theoretical fact. So it suggests, doesn't it, that all our worlds are in some way or other both personal to ourselves and extensive to other people. And in my last book, I was discussing what I call the egregorial, the idea that we create this reality around us and we manifest things within this reality. And of course, this then moves on, doesn't it, to something that initially I was quite anti, because I thought it was just some kind of new age cult happening, is the Mandela effect. The Mandela effect. And suddenly, suddenly some of the strange things. And I know in your book, you do the wonderful analogy, and you're quite right about this, because I checked it, is the thing with James Bond. And you're quite right. This is what I remember, and it's not true, or it's not within this universe. Can you just explain this for the listeners, so that they can check this out?
Yeah, we talked about this.
Sarah, do you know about this?
No, I haven't heard the James Bond one.
You don't? Okay, fine. So we can ask you now. So Jim, ask Sarah what she remembers about that film.
Did you ever see the movie Moonraker, James Bond movie?
Yeah.
Do you remember the villain in there, a guy named Jaws, had a big mouthful of metal? He was the henchman, right? He was in a couple of Bond movies. And there was a scene in Moonraker where I think he's in Rio on a cable car, and the cable car ends up crashing. And as he's pulling himself out of the rubble, this young woman comes by to help him come out of the rubble. Do you remember that scene? Her name was Dolly.
I thought there was a woman in the other film when they're on the spaceship.
Well, that's the one. That's the one. But there was a scene in that movie where they're not out in space yet. It was a terrestrial scene, and she helps him get out of the rubble. And they ended up falling in love. Do you remember that woman then?
I do remember that woman, but I don't remember her pulling him out of the rubble.
Okay, so I'm not sure that this will make a whole lot of sense, for Sarah. But the idea was, when he finally brushes himself off and looks at her, she looks up at him and she smiles, and she has braces on, and he has his mouth full of metal, and that like common bond between them, they both smile at each other, and kind of the music swells and everything, and they fall in love. And then at the end of the movie, they're walking off hand in hand. And it was just like a really silly kind of campy, example of those Roger Moore era Bond movies. Well, if you look at the movie today, she doesn't have braces. If you had a VHS sitting around, or a DVD, or you stream it however you want to, even something that's been sitting on your shelf for 20 years, and you play that movie, she does not have braces. But everybody remembers her having braces. In fact, the whole point of their falling in love made no sense without some common connection between the two of them, which happened when they looked at each other and smiled and saw that they both had metal in their mouth.
Well, wasn't there also some kind of articles and things about this as well? It wasn't just us remembering it wrongly. Other people,
Yeah, the BBC did an obituary on Richard Keel, and they mentioned, the famous scene with Dolly, who had braces and glasses, and they mentioned it, and that article, I think you can still find. So, what happened? So this is another perfect example, very easily explained by the quote simulation model, or the virtual reality model that we've been talking about all along. That for some reason, the system, God, all that there is, decided to rewrite the artifacts after everybody remembers it, or we have been implanted with false memories, one or the other. But it does imply that our reality and our consciousness is extremely soft and malleable. now the thing about the Mandela effect is they're coming out all the time. I mean, almost every day I read about another one, and I look at some of those and I'm like, yeah, I don't remember that. Or, so I think there's certainly the case where it's starting to lose its power in the noise of all of the ones that can be explained by people remembering things differently. So, for example, I think in the Monopoly board game, does the guy have a monocle or not? And I think there was I don't know, Mr. Peanut or something. There was some other character that had a monocle, and I think people have just like mixed those two things up. So there's good explanations for a lot of these, but there are certain Mandela effects that that people almost universally remember, and they don't make any sense that that they.
I think this is always the problem, isn't it? That what happens is that there is something and the evidence is really powerful, then it gets watered down by other people jumping on the bandwagon and coming up with other things. Now, the thing that has always intrigued me, and it's something I'll be touching upon in my new book, is the way in which, you were talking about subatomic particles and the relationship between the statistical wave function and the existence of subatomic particles. Now, you're probably aware of this, Jim, but the famous time when they were looking for the muon, and they come up with it as an idea, as a theoretical idea, as we know that Max Planck did in his act of desperation in 1900 when he came up with the quantum idea, the way in which Einstein with his cosmological constant and everything else, that these scientific things seem to be in people's minds, and then we discover them. And one of my favorite stories of this was a guy called Isaac Isambard Rabi, who was a winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics. And when they discovered the muon, his initial reaction when he heard they found it was, who ordered that? As if, we think about it and we almost collapse the wave function of these subatomic particles to bring them into existence. Now, of course, your model could explain that, because this is what is happening. Our anticipations of the reality are bringing things into reality by us thinking about them collectively or individually, because if we are all existing in our individual versions of reality. And I know that, you will, very good point, because the argument here is I'm looking at you at the screen now, but behind me are all my bookcases. But my bookcases don't need to be rendered in my reality because I'm not looking at them. They're only being rendered in yours. So behind me is a probability wave, which collapses when I turn around and the simulation says, no, Tony's now looking at the bookcases. I've got to collapse them so he can see them. And it's not so crazy, is it? Suddenly.
No. Yeah. And I think this is a little part of the explanation of the Zeno effect too, and the entanglement is once it's collapsed, it's collapsed. Once the system has said, okay, this thing exists, or it exists in this place or whatever, then, done. There's no reason to uncollapse it and make it probability again. So that's why entanglement works. Those particles, now they exist, they can be separated, and they stay in lockstep. But yeah, you mentioned the muon. It reminds me of, have you heard of the word anomalons?
I've touched upon it, but please expand. That sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the idea that there are particles that seem to be observed in certain research facilities and not in others. So you do the exact same experiment in Moscow that you do in London, that you do in New York, and possibly because of the mindset of the experimenters, they either see or don't see the particle or the anomalon.
Well, funnily enough, this is in my new book. I've come up with a new term, which I'm calling them the egregorions. And the egregorion, and the egregorion, it sounds like an anomalon, because it does seem that we have a much more direct relationship with external reality than we believe. But if all effectively everything is a singularity, and of course we could argue, couldn't we, that if the universe all started from a point, an infinitesimally tiny point, everything would have been entangled at that point because everything was in the same quantum state. So therefore, everything as it expands out and the universe expands out, and of course, the universe is expanding everywhere. When people turn around and say the universe is expanding, everywhere in the universe is expanding. Every little point is expanding at the same time. That if everything is entangled, this non-locality should suddenly make sense, because we're all part of the same thing, which could explain telepathy and everything else. Now, one of the things that I really loved in your book, and I love Venn diagrams. I've always adored Venn diagrams because I think they're so explanatory. And I'm just flicking through your books now. And the idea where you use a lot of Venn diagrams to explain the world and how it works and how solutions can be found by using Venn diagrams. Can you explain a little bit about how you apply those in digital consciousness? Because I think it's just such a powerful way of doing it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I agree with you. It's powerful. I believe it is as well. I think a lot of times people think about things, and I could be thinking of one thing, and you could be thinking of something else, and we'll go our merry ways thinking of different things, even though we're having a discussion. But when you draw it out, you create a visual model of it. You're like, yeah, now I know what you're talking about. Now we're aligned and we're thinking the same way. And that's what I tried to do in the book with the Venn diagrams. The other aspect of it is it's a way to show the scientific nature of this theory. So, it's very easy to say, that's just speculation or whatever. But, what is science? Science is, the scientific method is about observing things, coming up with a hypothesis, which I've done here and you've done in your books, testing it, analyzing it, reporting on that, and repeating it. Now, we don't get because I don't have a PhD after my name, I don't have the benefit of being able to, put things in scientific journals to get feedback on it. But the nature of the process is still the same. I'm observing things, I'm putting out a theory there, and I'm publishing that, and I'm, willing to have people respond and consider it and come up with examples of tests to test that theory and then refine it. That's the scientific process. And the other thing about the scientific process is it's not just all about empirical data. So when you talk to somebody and say, tell me about your near-death experience, that's you can't say that's not science. Anecdotal data is science when it's aggregated, when you have statistical significance about what people experience. And that's what, psychology is all about. That's what medicine is all about. How do we determine the efficacy of drugs by, understanding how people feel after they take them and so forth.
And yet, Jim, they always turn around and batter us back and say the plural of anecdote is not proof. But of course it is, isn't it? You're quite right.
Well, I would actually agree with that. I don't like the word proof ever. I think proof is something that exists in mathematics, but not in science. Science is it's evidence. And if the evidence is overwhelming such that the theory can generally be accepted, that's good enough. And that's, to me, that's science. So even, evolution, I've heard scientists say, well, evolution is fact. Well, is it really fact? Is it, how do you know the world wasn't created yesterday? And, you can't say it's 100% fact. Okay, there's a lot of evidence supporting it, and I'm with you there, but you can't say proof or fact or truth or something like that when you're talking about these things. But yeah, so in terms of the science, one method that's used is called abductive logic. So abductive logic is basically saying, what's the best fit to this situation? Medicine is a perfect example. And there's a lot of AIs now that'll say, okay, what are your symptoms? What's your history? Who have you been in contact? Blah, 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 all these kinds of things. All right, here's probably what's going on. AI is taking over in terms of medicine because it's so powerful, and it's able to see connections that, people have a hard time seeing. It's a little bit of our future is, AI and medicine and other areas is really going to take over. But that's abductive logic. And so science really embraces abductive logic. We do it in anthropology, evolutionary biology, intelligence analysis, even the Big Bang. There was no real observer of the Big Bang. All we are observing now is, cosmic background radiation and, redshifts and various things like that. And from that information, we put together the best fit theory. Well, the best fit theory didn't even work for a while until somebody came up with this inflationary idea that, seems kind of nonsensical to me. Oh, well.
Totally to me as well. That's the one thing, the whole idea that because the observations don't work, but the theory has to be made to work, we come up with some nonsense that the universe expanded thousands of times greater than the speed of light, purely and simply to accommodate the observations, because the observations don't fit with what we see. That's not science, is it? It's just so stories.
Yeah, it's a little bit science, because it's a, the scientists could say, okay, give me a better explanation for why all of this fits. And I'd say, well, here's mine, mine explains a lot more than yours does. And that's what I use the Venn diagrams for. I take 14 different anomalies. I have them here: dark matter, Mandela effect, observer effect, the finely tuned universe. And this is things like, you talk about cosmological constant, that it is like so perfectly fine tuned to orders of, 100 decimal points. Nature versus nurture, why do identical twins behave differently? Paranormal things, we talked about those, near-death experiences, spiritual, precognition, delayed choice, quantum eraser, the nature of matter, unification of quantum mechanics and relativity, all of these anomalies that we don't yet have answers for, both in the field of science and the field of metaphysics and other areas, philosophy. If you look at deterministic materialism in the Venn diagram, what I draw is circles around all of the anomalies that are explained by a quote theory of everything. Like materialism, it only explains one thing, the nature of matter. The string theory explains two things. Some, Abrahamic religions explain maybe 5 things. The Eastern philosophy explains 7 or whatever. The simulation theory of the Bostrom type or the matrix type explain all but 4. They don't explain near-death experiences. Why would we have those if, there were some AI in the future, just controlling everything? Why would people have spiritual experiences? Why would there be precognition? But my theory explains all of the anomalies. And so to me, it is scientific in that it is the best fit theory to all the evidence that we have out there. You can't just say, oh, we're only going to look at cosmological stuff and come up with a theory, or we're going to look at particle physics stuff and come up with a theory. Well, you didn't explain those anomalies in the paranormal research or the precognitive things, or why do people have spiritual experiences, or all of the other things. If you're really going to have a theory of everything, you got to explain everything.
No, absolutely.
So that's what the Venn diagrams are great for.
No, absolutely, because it shows the relationship and it shows the area of overlap that the pure explanation there goes. But isn't it, it's again fascinating, isn't it, the way in which science seems to truck along quite happily with these anomalies. The idea that you plug in the maths you use to explain relativity and you plug it into the quantum effects and you get infinities. So clearly, how can we have 2 completely contradictory worldviews, both of which work in their own way, but clearly do not work together, because there should be an overall explanation of reality that just resonates and works as something. And I'd argue, that your model is exceptionally good at doing that. And it again shows to me the way in which science is at the moment. If you're an outsider, your ideas are completely unaccepted. And they won't even look at them because you don't have a PhD. But since when did needing a PhD apply in medieval times? The great scientists then didn't have PhDs. They didn't need them because they were looking at the information and coming to conclusions. I don't ever recall Leonardo da Vinci having a PhD in anything. I don't recall Kepler having a PhD. Maybe he was a doctor of divinity or something, but not a scientific PhD. So in which case, go on, comment.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of, in our world now, which this is a good thing, I think there's a little bit of democratization going on. I totally agree with you that we have been in that place where you have to have a PhD to be credible, or to have, to get far in those areas, or to be remembered as the creator of something. However, the internet has really changed all of that. So take, for example, I don't know if you do any like stock market trading, but earlier this year there was this crazy anomaly with the company GameStop. It's a brick and mortar chain that sells video games, and their stock was in the doldrums. Now, the world of investing and stock trading has been the institutions. You know, these guys, the hedge fund traders, the fund managers, all that kind of stuff. They rule it. They rule the world. They move the market. You know, if they all decide they're going to dump Tesla, Tesla's going to drop, and you and I are going to suffer if we're holding Tesla because, you know, we're Johnny come latelys and we find about it too late. So, you know, it's an analogous kind of thing to the idea of, you know, this high tier of scientists and then everybody else who's actually thinking broadly. Same thing happened in the stock market, but these guys on Reddit got together and they pushed up the price of GameStop to this tremendous level where hedge fund managers were you know, selling huge positions and destroying their funds. And it was like the little guy is actually being paid attention to now. You know, so I think there is the future for people like you and I, where we don't have the time or the inclination or whatever to go back and spend you know, another 5 years getting a PhD and not earning any money in the meantime. You know, there's a future for us to have ideas put out there, because the expertise that's at the traditional levels of science is very deep and important in a lot of ways. You know, like, you know, a quantum physicist knows quantum mechanics really, really well. An astrophysicist knows cosmology extremely well, deeper than I ever will, deeper than you ever will. You know, all the credit in the world. But the deeper you know something, the narrower your scope is. You can't know everything deeply. It's just impossible. Our brains can't accommodate that. Maybe an AI could someday, but you and I can't. And it reminds me of that old statement, I think it was Mahatma Gandhi said, an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. Yes. And I'm certainly not saying that scientists know everything about nothing, but they do have a narrow point of view in a particular field. Generalists are going to be able to connect some dots because they have a broader view of things, even though they might not have the deep level of knowledge in certain fields. You and I are even generalists further because we're open, our minds are open to you know, metaphysical things and philosophical things and historical things that we spend our time researching and thinking about that scientists don't. So we're able to connect some dots. And I think there's a whole lot of value to that. And hopefully, you know, the platforms of your show and our books and, you know, the ability to self-publish and things like that will, you know, make a difference. It might not happen in our lifetimes, but you know, I think I think we're on the right track.
I think that's a perfectly good analysis of how education works and how it is. You know, that people, you know, friends of mine that got their PhDs, you know, they are incredibly intelligent people. But you know, there are friends of mine that will happily turn around and say, I've not read a book outside of my subject matter since I did my PhD, because I've not needed to. So, and there's a sense of pride about that. But of course, what's not going to happen is you're not ever going to see the bigger picture by this. You know, and as you say, if you try to be more of a Renaissance man or a Renaissance person, you know, you're going to be moving away and seeing the patterns in one way or another. Now, the question I always have is, it's always very good to do that once you apply rational sense to it. You know, I think at the moment we have an epidemic of Dunning-Kruger at the moment, whereby there are people who are blissfully unaware of the level of their own ignorance. And because they are not intelligent enough to realize that there are things they don't know, they think they know everything. And suddenly it's the guy that bores you down the pub because he knows everything about everything. But, you know, nobody knows what they don't know. And we might be suffering from Dunning-Kruger in exactly the same way. But I'd like to believe that our minds are open enough to actually suddenly discover a new idea and go, do you know what? If you apply the Unruh effect to the quantum Zeno effect, or you look at something from cosmology, you look at something from neurochemistry, and you think, no, there's a link here. There are links to be made. And I think people like you and I are needed, because we're not sky pilots. We do the research, you know, and you are one of my fellow writers, and I admire you so much on this, that you give the evidence, but you also give the supporting academic material so people can go away and make their own conclusions. And that is so powerfully important, Because this is bringing us right back, isn't it, to one of the big questions at the moment. You know, where is the world going now? Where is technology taking us? Where are we going to end up? I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's to be honest, like there's been in the back of my head this sort of like cognitive dissonance between where we're going as a society and my philosophy. Like it almost doesn't make sense. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, you know, this does kind of fit in a way. It's like our future looks kind of crazy. You know, quantum computers are going to be commercialized in 5 years. They're going to have, you know, 100 million times the power of computers today. AI, as I mentioned before, AI is taking over knowledge worker jobs like medicine, even creative jobs. I watched or listened to a song recently. You remember the band Nirvana?
Yeah.
There's an AI out there that has created a Nirvana song. You know, it was just basically given their entire catalog and said, you know, come up with something similar lyrics, sound of Kurt Cobain's voice, similar, you know, themes of music, and you listen to it, and it's like, well, Nirvana came out with a new song. I don't know how they did that, but it's AI. And so they're taking over things, and there's nowhere for anybody to go after that. Like when you had automation taking over factory jobs, there was a place for people to go. They could go into knowledge worker jobs. They could learn, you know, computational skills or whatever. But now there's almost nowhere to go that AI won't touch. So the future feels like work is going to be obsolete. But maybe that's okay, you know, in the sense of giving us meaning in what we do. It's important, but in the sense of working 40 hours a week and making some company, you know, money, is it important? I don't know. But anyway, like that's a trend. You know, the artificial meat, energy costs dropping. There are 4D printers now where AI designs can design and self-manufacture itself. You know, there are companies that are entirely autonomous. They don't have people. You know, just the world is just going crazy. And one of the aspects of this that has bothered me for a while is the transhuman movement, or H plus, humanity plus kind of idea. And this is the effort to make people immortal. Part of it is maybe uploading your consciousness into silicon. Part of it is, you know, 3D printed organs that will live forever, or, you know, can be replaced at any point in time. And so the emphasis seems to be life extension. But in my opinion, you know, as you know, I think our soul is immortal anyway. So why would we need to do this? And I think it's because it's driven by people who have a more of a materialist point of view about things. You know, if they were to realize that the world is the way you and I think it is, there might not be this emphasis behind life extension. I think there's a real reason why we die when we die. It's because we've reached the limit of our learning capacity. We've reached the limit of our ability to assimilate new ideas, evolve our consciousness, enhance our values, and things like that. We just become cranky old people, you know. And I'm joking a little bit, but if you think about, like, you know, the path that we take in terms of learning, you know, as a baby, we don't learn much. We have to develop our brains, and then we're on this steep curve, and then it kind of flattens out. Well, when it flattens out, it's time for a new adventure, right? It's time for a new set of learning, and maybe that's what reincarnation is all about. I mean, that's what the mystics say, and that's what spiritual experiencers say. So, you know, what does that mean? You know, what's going to happen when people start connecting their minds to other minds, or to the internet, or to AIs to enhance themselves? You know, and what I realized, and that's where it felt like a cognitive dissonance, but what I realized is that our souls, our consciousness may just get overloaded. We may say, I don't like the feel of that. I want to go back to being the way I was, you know, and I wouldn't be surprised. You know, we see these things throughout our history. You know, just in the past 200 years, there have been so many social evolutionary and technological evolutionary steps that seemed like they were going to destroy the world. automation back in the day in the late 1800s, people were prognosticating the end of the world because of that. In New York, they were prognosticating the end of the city because there were so many horses crapping all over the place that people were riding them more and more. And then along came cars and they didn't need horses. It solved that problem. Nuclear proliferation, we were a couple minutes to midnight in the 60s. Everybody thought there's just no way out of this. Well, mutual assured destruction and non-proliferation treaties managed to stave off that thing that looked like it was inevitable. Population explosion in the 70s, energy crisis in the 70s. Now it's global warming. Every time one of these things happens that look like is leading to an apocalyptic end of the world, something intervenes to slow it down, whether it's human nature, whether it's the system itself or whatever. And I think this specter of the technological singularity is going to fall into the same category. It may be just us that says, hey, we don't want this. I don't want to integrate with AI. I don't want enhanced intelligence because it's overwhelming my deep consciousness. Let the AIs go do what they want to do. I'm going to experience life and learn things the way my ancestors did. That may be what we do to stave off this spike that seems to be happening.
Or we create Skynet and start again with Terminator.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
One of the things here that I think the big issue with the whole Amiga point and the whole Ray Kurzweil argument and everything, which I find very beguiling and I find very, very interesting, by the way. But to me, one of the issues is, and you'll know the term, the substrate issue. And the substrate issue is a very simple idea that if I was able to take Sarah's brain and I was able to scan it down to the subatomic level and then recreate it digitally and upload that mind into a computer and then kill Sarah. Sorry, Sarah, we'd never want to do that, really. Where has Sarah gone? Is that...
I knew this was going to take a nasty turn.
I know, it's horrible, isn't it? And the idea, though, that Sarah is now gone within this reality, but she's been copied in some way. But of course, what it hasn't created is what the term we would use, her spirit, her soul, or whatever. All it is a facsimile of it. And I think this is where materialist reductionism misses the map for the territory. The idea
Absolutely.
that they can map the brain and they know exactly what parts of the brain do what when certain thoughts are. But that's confusing the matter. It's not really proving anything because consciousness may not be and awareness may not be in the brain. And as long as you try to do that, you're going to miss the point. And I think this is where probably it's going to break down slightly. And I think as a crotchety old man myself at the moment, and the idea everything irritates me now, absolutely everything about the world drives me crazy. And the ideas and everything else that people coming up with now just drive me to distraction. But, I watch my old father do it. I watch my grandfather do it. So it's what we do as older men. We just do. We have all the wisdom and knowledge of a lifetime and nobody listens to you anymore, because you're irrelevant. And I think that's probably the tragedy of getting old. And that's why we move on as we do. Right, Sarah, I'm aware we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Sarah, would you like to jump in with anything else or any other ideas, thoughts before we allow Jim to go off to his real life as a business executive?
There were a couple of things that I was just thinking there. One of them is actually, I do think longevity science will have an impact on the human race and consciousness, and maybe not a negative one, because I think that I do think that one of the big problems at the moment is this kind of distraction culture that we live in. And I'm a big Star Trek fan, and one of the things you notice in Star Trek is that technology and access to information is really used for good, to kind of learn and to educate the individuals that are in Star Trek, whereas our technology is really about binge watching Netflix and being distracted and watching tutorials putting on makeup and things like this. Like we're so saturated with absolutely useless information, but this resource of the internet is so powerful and wonderful. We could all be vastly improving ourselves and making PhDs obsolete, because everyone has access to the same amount of information as anyone that goes to universities these days, really, that, you know, you can access anything. So I do wonder whether we'll get a bit bored of just watching nothingness and having our brains used as kind of chewing gum to take on this kind of useless information, and actually get more into educating ourselves. And maybe we need a new discovery like the digital universe, or a new theory to get people excited about what consciousness is and think about expanding and evolving themselves. So I do think that longevity science and the field of nootropics and the idea of self-improvement is actually potentially really useful, but just to carry on living to buy more stuff from Amazon and watch more Netflix is pointless. It's like I've said so many times on this show, no one's ever going to be on their deathbed and say, oh, I wish I'd spent more time online. You know, we're going to realize at some point that actually we should just be out adoring nature and the elements and each other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sheer wisdom.
You know, that's a really good way of putting it. And it brings to mind, you're probably both familiar with Bob Monroe, you know, in his studies and his books. He had an experience where he traveled into the future and he was out of body. And at that time, most people were out of body. And he kind of flew over the earth and looked down, and he didn't see evidence of cities and things like that. And it was a smaller population. We were much more in tune with the surroundings, kind of Avatar-like, if you remember the movie. And, you know, it's always stayed in the back of my mind that maybe that's where we get to, you know, once we realize the spiritual nature of humanity, you know, and again, get away from the distracting types of things that drive us today. Maybe we will evolve to a more peaceful coexistence with nature at some point.
Yeah, maybe that's the singularity that that Kurzweil is talking about, or more in an idea of the Omega point of Teilhard de Chardin and people like that, you know, and the idea that we're moving, we're evolving, we're changing. But I sometimes feel that humanity is also changing into two different groups. There's the ones like ourselves that are really searching. We're looking for the sky, as you know, as what was it now? I can't think of the writer now, but you know, the idea that I may be in the gutter, but I'm looking at the stars, you know, and in Oscar Wilde, that was right. I knew you'd say it, Sarah, as the old statement goes about Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, I wish I'd said that. Oscar, you will. I'm sure you will. So thanks for that, Sarah. But you know, it's an interesting period to be alive. And it's going to be a challenging next few years, but I think humanity has extraordinary resilience. And I genuinely believe that writers like you, Jim, are the people that are going to be the vanguard for the future, because we need new ideas, we need new thinking, and we need to have open minds, you know, to so many things. And we need explanatory models that can explain the human experience. As you say, inclusive models that can explain out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, all these things. And you can't do that with just an exclusive materialist-reductionist model. Not that I'm criticizing the materialist-reductionist model, because without materialist-reductionism, we wouldn't be able to communicate now. So there's nothing wrong with the materialist-reductionist model, but there is a point where you take things apart and you end up with nothing. And that is the issue at the moment, I think. Right, Jim? Fascinating. And as always, we make time dilation happen, because we haven't had a full 2 years, 2 hours, because of the archons. So my apologies about lost time, but I am aware lost time as in Marcel Proust. I will go and taste my Madeleine cake in a few minutes and relive some wonderful memories. But effectively, Jim, if you want to tell us something about how people can contact you, about your books, about your website and everything else, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people out there who will be saying, this is really interesting stuff. I really want to know more about this. So please, Jim, fire away. The world's your oyster.
Sure, Penny. Thanks for the opportunity. And thanks again. You know, always wonderful to be on your show, and I love the conversations with you. They're just, you know, free flowing. You interview in a great way. You know so much that you can always take, you know, fascinating turns, and it's a great experience. Yeah, my book, the most recent one is Digital Consciousness. The first one was about 10 years ago, called The Universe Solved. My website is theuniversesolved.com. And on that site, there's a forum. There's a little more information about digital philosophy and access to my blog. The book can be purchased in Amazon and other online book retailers. So those are the basic outlets for it.
Wonderful. Right. Thanks, Jim. As always, I'd always love talking to you. We could go on for hours. We just scratched the surface there, as we always do. Really wonderful. So many ideas that are spinning out in my head. And the points you made, Sarah, were excellent, and it's got me thinking about other things as well in terms of going for the future.
Thanks, Anthony. Don't kill my brain just yet.
I'll try not to. We'll try not to. We're not going to upload you just yet. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for listening in. And this will be uploaded onto my YouTube site in the next few hours as well. And it will remain on my Facebook page as well. So thanks, everybody, for listening in. And we'll see you all again soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.